Welcome to the first series of the new mini-series here on Svarim Chatter, Rav Kook, Life and Legacy. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This mini-series will air in 1 week, starting with this Sunday's episode, Tuesday, Thursday, something new for Svarim Chatter, and it's being released this week because Rav Kook's yard site is this Friday, September 6th, which is Gimel Elul. Rav Kook is a highly controversial figure for some and highly respected by others. And I think for that reason, he makes for a very interesting figure and one whose life is explored a bit in depth on this mini-series. We discussed his biography, including the various controversies that he was involved with episode 1, this episode focusing on his life until his move to Eretz Yisrael as Rabbi of Jaffa. Episode 2 continues through the second part of his life, his first part of his life in Eretz Yisrael, through when he ends up stuck in Europe during World War I, Switzerland and England, and then it ends by when he returns to Eretz Yisrael as the chief rabbi of Jerusalem, and then the chief rabbi of Israel eventually. And episode 3 finishes with the latter part of his life and his impact and his legacy. And throughout, we discuss some of his thoughts and writings. However, I will mention that I think that could use more in-depth, and perhaps in the future, if listeners are so interested, please email me and let me know that's something that we can explore later. This mini-series is sponsored by Maggid Books, a division of Kollel Jerusalem, who is the proud publisher of several works by Rav Kook, including a commentary on the Siddur compiled by Rabbi Betzalel Naor, and the newly translated Hadarav, In His Inner Chamber, a collection of Rav Kook's most intimate writings found in his personal notebooks from throughout his career. They also have published Rav Kook's magnum opus, if you will, Orot in English, and they have a Hebrew-English edition, as well as a translation and commentary of Shabbat Haaretz, which is about Shemitah, and some other works as well. So listeners of Svarim Chatter can get 10% off all Koren and Maggid books with code Svarim Chatter, SEFORIMCHATTER. Visit www.korenpub, that's KOREN pub, PUB.com/Rav Kook, RAVKOOK today. So, and you can check out, there'll be a link for that in the show's notes below. And again, you can use the code Svarim Chatter for 10% off. They have, of course, besides for Rav Kook's Ram, they have many Siddur, Machzarim, works of Rabbi Steinsaltz, and much more. This first episode of the series is also sponsored by Simon and Danielle Springer in honor of the Midwest Torah Center and its Kollel Zakeinim entering its second year in South Bend, Indiana, in a town where you can live like a mensch, in a kollel geared towards giving the opportunity for all levels to transition into learning part or full-time. Midwest Torah Center's Kollel Zakeinim has become a huge hit, drawing new members locally and from all over the United States to South Bend. Visit www.midwesttorah.org/kollel, so that's MIDWESTTORAH.org/kollel, KOLLEL, for more information about the shul and the Kollel Zakeinim, as well as Parnas Hayom, Hashavua, and Achodesh options. To sponsor an individual episode of the podcast, please email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com, and you can also please subscribe to the WhatsApp community. You can see a link in the show's notes below, where I post new books, Svarim, book deals, and the like. And also, if you can please subscribe and rate the podcast wherever you listen, whether it's on 24/6, Apple, and Spotify. And finally, please let me know what your thought on this episode and this mini-series is in general, and whether Prof Kook specifically, and just in general, what you think of the mini-series. And we've done recently some more larger series, especially ones like the Tell No Shrive series, which is quite long. This is something a little shorter, more compact, and the new release schedule of trying this idea of 3 in 1 week and seeing how it goes over. So enjoy the episode, and I appreciate any feedback, whether you want to email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com, or you can also reach out and message me on WhatsApp if you're on the chat. And enjoy this episode, the first of the series. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast and a new mini-series here on the podcast, where I'll be joined by Professor Yehudah Mirsky, who is a professor at Brandeis University, where he teaches Jewish thought, political thought, the history of Zionism, and the state of Israel. And he lives actually most of the year in Yerushalayim. And this mini-series will be about, Professor Mirsky has written extensively about Rav Kook, Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, famously the first chief rabbi of Israel. And so we'll be discussing Ashkenazi chief rabbi, I should say. And so we'll be discussing Rav Kook, and he actually, Professor Mirsky, I'll say up front, has a really terrific biography titled Rav Kook, Mystic in a Time of Revolution, that was published through Yale, actually in their Jewish Live series. And he also, more recently, has a book that goes more in-depth on the first part of Rav Kook's life, titled Towards the Mystical Experience of Modernity, The Making of Rav Kook, 1865 to 1904. Which incidentally is the time period that we'll be discussing here on this first part, on this first episode. So that's really the first book, and that's published by Academic Studies Press, and there'll be links in the show's notes for both of those books. And we'll discuss a lot more than just those books, so when it comes to Rav Kook. So thank you, Professor Mirsky, for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Okay, so I'm from New York. I grew up on the west side of Manhattan. I often like to make clear that this is the pre-gentrified west side of Manhattan. I grew up in, I went to MTA. I learned in the Gush in Yeshivat Har Etzion for a couple of years. Did my BA at YU. My family was very, very involved in YU for a very long time. My grandfather and my father, Zichronan Livracha, spent most of their lives there, teaching and more. I, at some point, got a law degree, and I worked for some years in the U.S. in policy circles in Washington, including in the U.S. State Department's Human Rights Bureau during the Oslo years. And actually, it was the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin that made me decide I needed to go back to school and finally go on Aliyah. And so that's when I went back to university and did doctoral work and eventually plunged into Rav Kook and made Aliyah. And so here we are today. And I divide my time, as you said, between Boston and Yerushalayim. Basically, I live in Yerushalayim, and I'm in Boston for a few months a year.
So how did you become interested in Rav Kook? I imagine many people are interested in Rav Kook. And actually, this is even just to mention before that, you'll explain in a minute, but for the listener, I think a lot of listeners always hear people speak about Rav Kook, whether it's on the right or the left. So people are very interested in Rav Kook. They want to hear about him. They're very pro Rav Kook. They're in the Dati Leumi modern Orthodox world, or people in the Yeshivish world, and they're like not interested in Rav Kook, and they're anti Rav Kook,
or interested in a distinctive sort of way.
Exactly. So I think that's what hopefully this podcast, this mini series, will be interesting and informative for the listener. And we do plan on discussing the controversies, Rav Kook's stories, writing. We plan on running the full gamut and covering everything, so you can kind of hear, and learn about it. Okay. So, but how did you become interested in Rav Kook?
I mean, with me, in my case, it's a funny sort of thing. Well, fundamentally, I grew up very modern Orthodox, very classically modern Orthodox. And of course, sort of the great culture hero and role model we were zocheh to have was, Rabbi of Jaffa Soloveitchik and all that he represented and that orientation. And I really discovered Rav Kook's writings when I went to learn in the Gush, Yeshivat Har Etzion. I arrived there for Elul Zman in 1978. And I would say the doors to Rav Kook were opened to me by the late Rosh Yeshiva Rav Yehudah Mital, or Rabbi whose yahrzeit is coming up in a couple of weeks. And I found that learning Rav Kook, I mean, it's a whole story and whatever ruchnias, et cetera, things I was going through at the time. But Rav Kook offered a whole different perspective on religious life, on one's own internal life, on seeing oneself as part of like larger historical processes, but also larger spiritual processes at work in the world. Rav Kook had this way of, in the writings of Rav Kook and teachings that I was exposed to, this way of, on the one hand, like deepening your sense of responsibility while expanding it at the same time, something very profoundly validating and deeply challenging at the same time. I mean, that's all very vague, and we'll unpack that as time goes by. But it's just, for me, was a revelation. And once I started digging into it, it was only after I started learning Rav Kook more and more did I discover that actually my grandfather, who was named Shmuel Kalman Mirsky, had been a disciple of his back in the early days. And so I suspect that's also part of why. And my father didn't talk much about Rav Kook, but a certain version of Rav Kook's teachings was sort of, I guess, in the air in the home in which I grew up, even if it was never quite stated as such.
Okay. As I mentioned with the title of your second book, the year Rav Kook is born is in 1865. That's in the subtitle of the book. Let's start there. Where was Rav Kook born? Who were his parents? What was his youth like? Because I think we have to start all the way in the beginning. And to be clear, let's clarify already right here in the front. The plan is that this first episode will cover Rav Kook's first years, the first part of the book, until 1904, until he's appointed Rabbi of Jaffa, and he goes to the land of Israel. And so then we'll cover, that'll be part 2, and then we'll get to part 3. So we'll leave part 1, though, is his first formative years in Europe. So let's talk about his birth and his upbringing.
And before I do that, just one very prefatory comment. When people ask, who is this guy, Rav Kook? So usually most of us, what we know about him is, as you said, the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi, and often thought of as, to this day, the most, consequential thinker for religious Zionism. Now, that's true, but I've long thought that in some ways those are some of the less interesting things about him. Just like a fascinating personality, but also somebody who, so to speak, like cast himself into all the most riveting controversies and contradictions of modern Jewish life. Also cast himself into the entire sea of Jewish learning, halacha and Kabbalah and philosophy and piyud and trying to effect some like large synthesis of all of it while respecting all the different voices, perspectives, points of view. And that's I think a lot of what accounts for what makes him so interesting, what makes him a fascinating figure, an inspiring figure, a tragic figure, who knows. So he's born I think that's important to state at the outset. He's born in 1865 and he dies in 1935. So let's just think about the lifespan that he lives through, right? He dies in the last year of the American Civil War, right? Into 1865. And so it's when he's born in 1935, he dies 2 years after Hitler has risen to power. 13 years before, shortly before the Holocaust, and 13 years before the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. So he is born in a cultural area. Technically, where he was born is today considered Latvia, but tachlis, for our purposes, it was Lithuania, right? It was Lita, Lithuanian Jewry with all that implies, and a part of Lithuania called Courland, on the western edge of the Russian Empire. He's born into a family of a mixed marriage, so to speak. His father was from an Misnagdism hadn't been invented all that long before, right? But his father's family had been Misnagdim for generations, and his mother's family was a descendant of Chabad Hasidim. And as we know, like Chabad was the Lithuanian form of Hasidus. And from an early age, he exhibited tendencies that sort of led his parents to have a playful running joke. Was their eldest son, going to grow up to become a Litvish Rosh Yeshiva or some sort of like Hasidic Rebbe? And of course, in what eventually became characteristic Rav Kook fashion, he grows up to become both and neither at the same time. He is an Ilui. He's a prodigy. He is educated like most people of the time. We talk a lot about the great yeshivas, like Volozhin, of course, and he gets to Volozhin eventually. But these great yeshivot, for a number of reasons, because they were such dramatic institutions, and because the kind of training that people got there enabled them to rebuild institutions after the Holocaust, the great yeshivot tend to obscure the view of all the small local batei midrash in which most people did most of their learning in that time. Professor Moti Zalkin did a marvelous study a number of years ago, just studying all sorts of Talmidei Chachamim. See, like so many people had trajectories similar to what Rav Kook's was, that like you learn in all sorts of local batei midrash, and then eventually you go to Volozhin or to another big yeshiva for a year or two to sort of like to finish yourself off before you get married and so on. So he learns in local batei midrash. From an early age, he's born in a shtetl called Griva, which is essentially a suburb of Dvinsk. From about 9 years old, he's learning with the Litvish rabbi. Dvinsk usually had like two rabbanim, a Hasidic rabbi and a Litvish rabbi. At one point, the Or Sameach was the Hasidic rabbi of Dvinsk. At any rate, he's learning with the Litvish rabbi of Dvinsk, Rav Ruvain Levin, who was sort of a kind of, so to speak, like a Talmud Chacham's Talmud Chacham. Like he's not a very big name in the history of Gedolim, but the other Gedolim always refer to him with great reverence. And then he learns in different local batei midrash, and also, and this is not at all uncommon, we tend to think of the history of Jewish life in Eastern Europe as like having very definite lines between Chassid, Misnagid, and Maskil, right? People of the Enlightenment. And often the lines are rather blurred. You'll have people, some of the rabbis Rav Kook learned with are have, so to speak, like yeshivish Lithuanian Talmudic chops, but are also studying Hasidus and teaching Hasidus, right? You have important rabbis, including in his family circle, who have relationships with Haskalah, like Mordechai Gimpel Yaffa. Rav Mordechai Gimpel Yaffa is his great uncle, for instance, right? Yosef Zcharia Stern is like a relative by marriage, and there's some, and so what does Haskalah mean, right? If we think about these terms, Haskalah, throughout Jewish history, we have Talmidei Chachamim who are studying, poetry, philosophy, mathematics, all these kinds of things, right? So when does something become Haskalah? Something, so to speak, crosses the line into Haskalah when people are studying these things as part of like a deliberate effort to try and bring Jewish life into line with the surrounding culture, right? And to think about revising Jewish life and Jewish education. And there are some people who are doing that in more non or even anti-traditional ways, but certainly in Eastern Europe, in circles known as the Vilna Haskalah, Rashi Fin, and people like that, people are doing it in much more traditional minded ways. Dr. Gil Pearl has this really interesting book about the Netziv of Volozhin, and especially the Netziv of Volozhin's early writings and the extent to which he was involved in Maskilic writings. And so for young Avram Yitzchak Kook. And also another crucial feature of like what being a quasi-maskil in these years meant studying medieval Jewish philosophy. So if you take a look in the memoirs of young maskilim, you find certain works come up. And then I started learning the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim, and I started learning Rabbi Yosef Albo's Sefer Ikarim, and I started learning Rabbi Yitzchak Arama's Akedat Yitzchak. And if you take a look, those are also works that show up an awful lot in Rav Kook's early writings, right? So he is this prodigy. He's very intellectually alert. Very inquisitive mind. We have some very early writings of his. He reads things from Jewish Renaissance writings, Jewish Renaissance writings, and things like Abraham Yagel and Azariah Figo. And then he goes to Volozhin. And when he goes to Volozhin, so Volozhin is this remarkable institution. Volozhin is it's like a greenhouse for intense young men from all over Eastern Europe. And all the different schools of thought and ideologies and so on of the day are alive and kicking in Volozhin. So if we look, say, if some of his exact contemporaries, the people who are there in the same year or so that he's there, one of them is Rav Zalman Meltzer, right? Eventually, great Gadol, author of Eben Ezel, member of Motzei Kedulei Torah, and so on. Another is Micha Yosef Berdichevsky, who is like the bad boy of early Hebrew literature, who translates Nietzsche into Hebrew, who famously writes a few years later, we must decide if we will be the last Jews and the first Hebrews. Right? So all this stuff is going around in Beit Midrash. The main figures, the most prominent figures in Volozhin at the time are the Rosh Yeshiva, the Netziv, Naftali Tzvi of Berlin, and Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, not yet Reb Chaim, so also known as Reb Chaim Brisker, who's a Maggid Shir there. And young Avram Yitzchak Kook becomes very close to the Netziv, and he regards the Netziv in many ways as his master. The Netziv, when there's young men in Volozhin who are having problems in Emunah, the Netziv directs them to go talk to Avram Yitzchak Kook because he has this way of thinking about things, this way of talking about things. There's an amazing story told by Rav Zelig Reuven Bengis, who eventually became a very important dayan in Yerushalayim, about how, they noticed that Avram Yitzchak Kook had his stender, and at his stender he had some papers that he was always looking down at. And so they put two and two together. This is Volozhin. This is, the 1880s. So obviously he's reading some Maskilic newspaper, right? And they go to the Netziv to complain, and the Netziv says, leave him alone, he's a tzaddik. So like one day, Rav Kook leaves his stender for a few minutes to get a drink of water, whatever. So they run over to see what's on the piece of paper that he's looking at all the time while he's learning. And on the piece of paper is written, Shvisi Hashem Lenegditam. Right. So in this curious kind of way, it's like he's more pious than they are, but in a way that doesn't obviously make sense, right? Or he's sort of like marching to his own drummer. He had a beard. Most guys, a lot of people in Volozhin didn't have beards. He used to daven with great fervor, even though he technically wasn't a chassid, and like only chassidim davened that way. So he was this. What's going on in the Jewish world in those years? So it's the Jewish world in sort of as we're getting to the, remember he's born in 1865. So the Jewish world in Russia is slowly radicalizing. In the 1860s and the 1870s, there was sort of like a broader liberal kind of spirit in Russia, that the idea that Russian society could liberalize, which that meant was that Jews could go on being Jews while participating in Russian society, that they could have freedoms without having to, so to speak, get rid of their Jewish identities, that official anti-Semitism was diminishing, etc. For a variety of reasons, in the 1880s, that ends. So Russian liberalism bichlal goes by the boards in the 1880s. So like also Jewish liberalism isn't much of an option. Trying to improve the status of the Jews by working through Russian society in the direction of reforming it and making it better is not an option. So Jews radicalize. Jews radicalize to socialism. And also in terms of how to adapt religiously, we start getting the emergence in Eastern Europe of what we call orthodoxy. By which I mean, when the Chassam Sofer creates orthodoxy, because, what does it mean creates orthodoxy? That sees oneself in a defensive position as an ideology fighting against all sorts of people around it, right, who are trying to undo it. And that really takes hold in the 1880s. So it's part of this general radicalization of Russian Jewish culture. He becomes engaged to his wife, to Batsheva Rabinovitz Ta'omim, the daughter of the Aderet, Rav Yehudah Rabinovitz Ta'omim, the Rav Panovich, very important Chacham of the time. And the idea is that he will be able to learn for a while after his marriage, and hopefully, go on to great things as a Rosh Yeshiva. That doesn't happen for a bunch of reasons, largely financial. Being a rabbi in Eastern Europe was a very, very hard life. Actually Rav Kook's first father-in-law, the Aderet, leaves us. Wrote a book called Nefesh David, which is an autobiography, which is remarkably candid, and he talks about the difficulties. And at some point, when the Balabatim and Panovich decided just to stop paying his salary, so he actually got a heter from Rabbi Kochanan to go on strike, which meant to not deliver psak, which is kind of mind-boggling when you think about it. Things like as if the stirrings of socialist revolution hadn't entirely passed them by. But at any rate, it meant that the Aderet was poverty-stricken and simply couldn't support his son-in-law, and so his son-in-law had to go and get a job as the Rav of a shtetl, and indeed he was encouraged by the Chavetz Chaim, who was on very good terms with the Aderet. The Chavetz Chaim thought that he could do great things as a rabbi. So he becomes the rabbi of a shtetl called Zaimel or Zaimlis, small place, about 1,000 people. And there it's because his communal duties aren't all that extensive. It's not a very big place, so he has a lot of time to learn. He starts publishing a journal. He had already started to write, it's shortly after leaving Volozhin. His very first articles are both about the Netziv. In one of them, in a journal called Machziki Hadas, there had been a critical article about the Netziv, and he takes up the cudgels to defend the Netziv, and specifically about the Netziv's attitude towards Agadata and how the Netziv talks about Agadata in his Torah commentary, Hamig Davar. And then the second was like in a Maskilic publication where they were doing profiles of important Jewish leaders and thinkers of the day. And so he wrote one about the Netziv. So it's interesting that these are also two faces of the Netziv, right? The Netziv has an outward facing face. I mean, he's participating in the larger culture in some ways. And of course, a huge, in some ways the Netziv is still like the Rosh Yeshiva of us all in some ways. And those are his very first writings. But then he starts publishing, also generally Hebrew and Yiddish periodical and print culture in this time is remarkably rich. If you go to the website of the National Library of Israel, nli.org.il, there is a section, a database called Historic Jewish Press. And you can read PDFs of all kinds of Jewish publications in Hebrew and Yiddish and Ladino and German and French and English, whatever. But for our purposes here, if you look at what's being written in these Jewish periodicals in Eastern Europe in the late 19th century, remarkably interesting, remarkably intense debates. And people who we think of as quote unquote like Orthodox rabbis, and I guess by our definitions they are Orthodox rabbis, and they're important poskim or whatever, but that doesn't mean they're not discussing philosophy and history and the issues of the day in a very vivid way. And he decides to create a journal, and it's called Itur Sofrim. Itur Sofrim, he says this will be a new Torah journal. He thinks this is a place, the Jewish world is starting to be consumed by arguments, and this is a journal. It's a place where we can thrash these things out. And the idea is also like to write Torah literature in like a nice literary style. That to have like a Torah periodical that's like along the lines of the other periodicals of the day. And he also writes himself and commissions some essays or publishes some essays by other people arguing for a kind of a more systematic approach to halakha, right? In a sense, like what you sort of have roughly at the same time, say the way the Stei Chemed is doing his book and sort of organizing things alphabetically in a way. And this idea that it would be really helpful the same way and by the way, this isn't just going on by the Jews. You find other legal systems. You find other people in the 19th century in Islamic law saying we need to systematize our legal writing, etc. Parenthetically, also the Itur Sofrim is one place. The Netziv publishes an article there. It's where the Netziv publishes that you can read the famous thing of the Netziv that you can read newspapers on Shabbos. Well, he calls them Kitvei Eid, so it's unclear if he means newspapers or periodicals. Now, one last comment about periodical culture of the time is that Rav Kook himself never gets a secular education. He never goes to university. The only languages he knows are Hebrew and Yiddish, and through Yiddish some German, and eventually years later he learns English. He seems not to know Russian. And so the question is, as time goes by, he has a certain facility with Western culture, philosophy, history, literature, etc. And where did he get it from? So you could learn an awful lot by reading those newspapers and periodicals at the time. I mean, the example, sort of if I were to compare it to something in the present day, if we were to take, a young Avrech who's like super bright and intellectually curious and doesn't go to university, but gets subscriptions to some really excellent periodicals, right? And reads also, there were all sorts of books in Hebrew and in Yiddish that were histories of philosophy, right? Or if you read journals like, most famously the Hashiloach, the journal that Achad Ha'am put out, right? So like Hillel Zeitlin writing these multi-chapter essays explaining who is Nietzsche or who is Aristotle and so on. You could learn an awful lot. You could pick up an awful lot. Now, so he's this young rabbi, very learned, intellectually adventurous, wants to start this journal, etc., and then tragedy strikes. First off, again, that he has to take this job as the rabbi of Shtetl, but then also his first wife dies after the birth of their oldest daughter. And it's a great tragedy. She dies very suddenly. Not long thereafter, he remarries to one of his wife's cousins, also because the Aderet his father-in-law is so attached to him that he doesn't want to lose him. He wants to keep him as his son close by. And he goes on writing, but he doesn't publish for a long time. He sort of goes silent for a long time. And it is in this period of mourning and despondency for his wife that he starts seriously learning Kabbalah. He starts learning with the Baal HaLeshem. And actually now is a good time to say a word about this thing called Lithuanian Kabbalah. When people talk about, when people say Kabbalah in the modern world, you think, well, Hasidus or, whatever. Actually, yes, in a way, like you can't understand Hasidus as a movement without understanding certain Kabbalistic ideas that are at the basis of it. But this thing called Lithuanian Kabbalah is in some ways what is Lithuanian Kabbalah? Lithuanian Kabbalah is sort of like a rough school that's kind of defined geographically, people studying Kabbalah in the cultural area of Lithuania, who are not Hasidim, who see themselves as disciples ultimately of the Vilna Gaon. And of course, the Vilna Gaon wrote as much Kabbalah as he wrote anything else. And also their approach to Kabbalah is appropriately in good Litvish fashion. It's very scholastic, right? In Hasidut, you don't have a lot of commentaries on canonical Kabbalistic texts. You have a few, but not many, or straight out Kabbalistic treatises. Whereas in Lithuanian Kabbalah, you do. And there's another feature of Lithuanian Kabbalah that's sort of widely shared and very important, and that's a relationship to the Ramchal, to the teachings of Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. So the Ramchal, who dies sort of like mid-18th century, and it's kind of remarkable that the Ramchal in his lifetime is extremely controversial and he's persecuted by many of the rabbis of his time. And it doesn't take long till after his death before his works have attained canonical status. So the Kabbalistic writings, the Vilna Gaon had said that the Ramchal's understanding of the Kabbalah of the Ari was essentially authoritative, right? And much of that is that also that the Ramchal understood, the remarkable mythic kind of anthropomorphic imagery of Kabbalat Haaretz to be understood philosophically and conceptually. And a key feature of the Ramchal's thought also is the idea that tikkun, the great ultimate, messianic restoration of the world, is something that happens through historical time. It doesn't pop from the outside of history. There's hashgacha that works through human history to bring about redemption. And one way of thinking about Rav Kook in these early years is that, the Ramchal was a real culture hero in Eastern Europe. And he was a culture hero for all kinds of people, in all kinds of circles. He was a culture hero for the Musar movement, of course, about which we'll talk in a moment, right? He's a culture hero, or he's an important figure for Lithuanian Kabbalah. He's an important figure for Hasidut, because the idea, so for him, the Ramchal's conception of Kedusha is like a transformation of everyday, daily, corporeal life into something sacred, which very much resonates with Hasidic teaching. And he was also a culture hero for Maskilim, because he's very philosophically minded, because also he writes these treatises on logic. He writes in this beautiful Hebrew. He writes literature. He writes plays, and one way of looking at young Rav Kook, because by this point he's a rabbi, he's ordained by the Aruch HaShulchan, is that he's somebody who combines all these different Ramchals, that he's somebody who is engrossed in the Ramchal as a Kabbalist, and the maskilic side of the Ramchal, both like to be in conversation with broader philosophical trends and the importance of felicitous literary expression, and an intense personal spiritual life, as well as the kind of self-discipline and self-growth and self-cultivation that comes from that we associate with Musar. So during these years, you see, like early on, Avram Yitzchak Kook very much wants to publish. His wife dies, and he starts learning Kabbalah, and he becomes more introspective, and also crucially starts keeping a diary, a spiritual diaries, journals, about which more in a moment. And he undertakes a kind of journey of introspection as well. Now, in 1891, he publishes anonymously a book called Chevish Pe'er, which is a little treatise about the importance of the proper placement of tefillin shel rosh. And it's a slightly strange book because it's this like remarkably vigorous polemic. He publishes it anonymously under the title just published by Kohen Da'ato Yafeh. And it's this vigorous polemic about the importance of the proper placement of tefillin shel rosh, and also blaming a lot of the problems afflicting the Jewish people from the improper placement of tefillin shel rosh, and rabbis and wealthy balabatim who are mezalzel in the proper placement of their tefillin shel rosh and all that. So it's very invigorating, but also rather strange when you read this. But from his notebooks, we see the theological reflections that accompany it. By the way, what he does is he goes around also and to preach on this book. And he says he's doing it on behalf of the author who wants to remain anonymous. He doesn't tell people that he wrote it. He makes a point of going to places where people didn't know him. He doesn't go back to Volozhin. He doesn't go back to the shtetls like where he learned when he was young, like, Smorgon or Lutzen. He stays away from there. It's like he's on some kind of pilgrimage. And it's important for him to be anonymous and not to be, if early on he enjoys publishing and having his name here, now he wants to be anonymous. He doesn't want people to know who he is. And so eventually in the 1920s, we're not going to talk now about the publication history of Rav Kook's writings, but in the 1920s, when he's famous and chief rabbi, there's published a set of the sermons that he gave or that accompanied his travels on Chevish Pe'er. And we now know that we have the originals in this notebook that he started keeping in those years, in the 1890s, which was published in 2018 under the title Mitziot Katan. And if we look there at these, the drushes enable us to understand what's going on with this strange book about tefillin, because a question that is preoccupying him intensely is the relationship between the mind and the body. In some respects, it's a very Litvish question, right? The seichel and the guf, and the seichel and the guf, and he goes at this over and over and over and over. And of course, then tefillin shel rosh are the nexus, literally the nexus of the mind and the body, right? And he unpacks this in these drushot. So you see that this is an issue that's preoccupying him greatly. He also starts writing, the early 1890s are the years when the study of Musar is starting to really establish itself in the yeshiva world in Lithuania, right? And with great controversy. Because the study of Musar was not, first off, there were any number of people for whom, like, the study of Musar is just a departure from yeshiva curriculum. The study of Musar was also not like a polite Musar Seder half an hour before Ma'ariv. We have eyewitness descriptions of what Musar Seder was, where, somebody would bang and then everybody would start just like one line from Hakina Vataiva Vakavra Mutzimas Adam in Olam or whatever, and just start shouting it again and again and again and again and banging their heads on the desks and stuff. There were Batei Musar next to the yeshivas where people would go and just have these Musar sessions, sort of like giving chizik to one another or insulting one another. And so, all of these somewhat outlandish behaviors that are associated with Musar. And also there were some students who really didn't like the idea of Musar. Like, I'm here to learn. I'm not here to have some mashgiach, keep a stopwatch and see how long it's taking me to daven. So it was very controversial. And eventually, he's really intrigued by this. And it's in his responses to the Musar movement in the early 1890s that we start seeing a characteristic feature of Rav Kook's thought and outlook and personality, where he sees a controversial issue in the Jewish world of the time. He understands, he tries to see what are the legitimate arguments that are being made on either side. How is there a way to reconcile them, and also a way to do it through learning, through Torah? And so, for instance, there's a little-known essay of his that is published only many, many decades later, Al Hapnimius of Limud Torah. And he talks about the different spiritual curricula available at the time. And he walks through what are the advantages of like Litvish style learning and what are its disadvantages. What are the advantages of a Hasidic approach to Torah and mitzvahs and what are the disadvantages? What are the advantages of Musar and what are the disadvantages? What are the advantages of like studying philosophy like the Rambam did and what are its disadvantages? And how does one create some sort of synthesis around this? It's a very characteristic idea. And it's roughly at this time that he also starts writing a commentary on Agaritas that eventually is published under the title Ein Hayah. Ein Hayah is it's a line from Sefer Iyov, the day, Lo shezafto Ein Hayah, the eye of the falcon. And of course, Ein Hayah Aleph Yud Hey is an acronym for Avram Yitzchak HaKohen. And this is this, as I read it, and I've spent a lot of time with Ein Hayah is sort of meant as like a study book for Musar. So like, how do you take the positive idea of Musar that you're supposed to cultivate yourself and your religious personality, right? And take your religious life seriously, but do it in a way that is still emphasizing the centrality of Limud Torah, as well as expanding your idea of what Limud Torah can be. And this idea of self-cultivation, you see, if we look at his writings in Ein Hayah, I remember a few minutes ago I mentioned that he is very much studying medieval Jewish philosophy of the Rambam and like that. And a very central theme in medieval Jewish philosophy is the cultivation of shlemut, which often gets translated as perfection, but I don't think that's a good translation. Better translation is wholeness or flourishing. Right? How do you create yourself as a person, right? Very much for the Rambam, the life of Torah and mitzvot is, so to speak, like a system of moral and spiritual, ethical, cultivation where you work on yourself and you educate yourself to try to turn yourself into a certain kind of person. So he takes these ideas and he with them in hand, he reads through the Agaritas of Masechet Brachot. By the time he leaves for Eretz Yisrael in 1904, he's sort of pretty much gone through Masechet Brachot and is well into Masechet Shabbat, and then he works on this on and off for the rest of his life. There's something else that he writes in the early mid 1890s, and it's a large collection of drashot called Midbar Shur. And he writes them between 1894 and 1896, and the themes, and very explicitly there, the themes in Midbar Shur is the self-cultivation, the mitzvah of like building oneself and one's moral character, and one's spiritual character through a life of practice in Torah and mitzvot. And an issue that's in sort of in here working out again, the relationship between the mind and the body, how the mind disciplines the body. And an issue that's starting to really interest him, the relationship between universal ethics and specifically Jewish ethics. What is the relationship between, and this is an issue that's at the, at the very beginning, starting from Avram Avinu's argument with God over Sodom. So when Abram says to God, Afti spet tzadikim rasha shofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat, so Avram Avinu is like invoking a universal moral standard, and he's only in this conversation with God because he's in an intimate covenantal relationship with God in the first place, right? God says, ki yadati leman asher yitzaveh, right? So this what is the relationship between like there are elements of ethics and that Judaism shares with everyone, with the good people of the world beyond like quote unquote Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, right? And this is an issue that's preoccupied many people, and the Rambam discusses it at length, and these medieval Jewish philosophers discuss it at length. And so he's very intrigued by that, and he starts relating it to his interest in body and mind, that maybe so to speak, like the, natural morality, ethics, the basics that everybody, that any decent society, right, the Meiri society, people, umot hagdurot darchei hadat, which means like people who are living by some sort of compelling, transcendent moral code, right? So that's like the guf of the world. That's the body. That's how you order society. Torah takes you like to a deeper level or to a higher level, a more truly universal and cosmic level, and also your relationship to God and transcendence. So he's working this through in these drashot. And there's another process that's going on with him, and we see it in his notebooks. And that he, it sounds rather prosaic, but if you're an up-and-coming Litvish Talmid Chacham, you're not supposed to enjoy learning Agarata and Machshava as much as he does. Right? You look at, as we see like in so many sources that tell us, yes, Agarata, that's what you teach women and children. Right? That's what you do when you're bored or when you're relaxed. That's not right. But he sees that he's deeply, deeply drawn to this. And in some respects, he writes in the introduction to this book of Drashot, Midbar Shur, he says, sometimes I think that actually if I have a real koach of chidush, it's less in halacha than it is elsewhere. And during this time, he's writing tshuvas, he's writing chidushim, he's writing all these things, right? And when we read his tshuvas, we see he's got like remarkable bikiyut and all of that. But he starts reflecting, and also remember, he starts reflecting on some of this and some of the relations, some of the ideas of the Ramchal. Ramchal said that the tikkun happens through history, and every human being has a role to play in the tikkun. So if I see that I'm drawn to learning Agarata, and I'm actually in some ways maybe better at it, I think, than I am at learning halacha. Of course, I go on learning halacha, but maybe then it's okay. And also remember, he spent time in Volozhin. People who had troubles in Emunah were sent to him. And a lot of the people who, like I mentioned Micha Yosef Berdichevsky, right? So like his yeshiva classmate who becomes this renegade apikoros, who then devotes himself to the rest of the Jewish people. See, like he starts noticing that all around him, traditional Jewish society is it's one of these, it's in both great collapse and great creativity, right? Traditional Jewish society is collapsing everywhere, mass defections from the tradition, grinding poverty, mass immigrations to America, and at the same time, there's all kinds of interesting things going on. People writing machshava, people writing poetry, people trying to create new kinds of social organizations. And he's aware of this. And he begins to notice that a lot of the principled heretics, a lot of the Kofrim and the Apikarsim and the Mumrim around him are actually great idealists. Right? He begins to notice that they're not, okay, there's people who leave Torah and mitzvahs because they want easy lives, but he begins to notice the ones who aren't looking for easy lives. They're fighting the Tsar. They're trying to help the oppressed. They're trying to help the Jewish people, and you realize he has to take them seriously. And you'll notice that we're already in the late 1890s, and a word that I haven't mentioned yet is Zionism. Because he's not part of it. Like there is a Chibat Zion, there's this proto-Zionist movement. We'll get in a second to like what do we mean by Zionism. But like there's a proto-Zionist movement called Chibat Zion that's important in Eastern Europe. People, relatives and teachers of his are involved in it in one fashion or other. He's not. During the time that he's in Volozhin, there's like a Chibat Zion society, and he's not part of it, right? Some people say, well, it's a secret society. What do you want? There's no evidence that he was involved in this, right? He was not part of the Zionist. He was not part of the Zionist movement. We'll be talking about this. That might sound surprising to some listeners because, after all, isn't this the big Zionist rabbi? So the point I'm trying to make is that when he gets to Zionism, he comes to it because Zionism helps him deal with a bunch of a cluster of theological and religious and halachic, etc., issues that he was thinking about anyway, or that he was thinking about before. What is the relationship between the Jewish body and the mind? And what's the relationship between Jewish ethics and national identity and the rest of humanity, right? How do we understand, also, if a crucial doctrine of the Kabbalah that was really important from both as a teaching and as well as like a lived experience was the line in Tikkunei Zohar, let atar panui minei, there is no space devoid of God. So if the Rebbeinu Shalom is never absent, how do I explain that like some of the best Talmidim in yeshiva are becoming apikorsin? What's going on here, right? Is there a theodicy of modern times? Is there something going on here? Is God working through history? Is God trying to tell me something? I don't know. And it's all very iffy and tentative at these points. The very first comments that he makes when he hears about the first Zionist Congress in 1897, he writes a booklet that doesn't get published till a long time afterwards. And, one of the things that first gets tossed around at the first Zionist Congress, the idea, well, maybe we'll create a Sanhedrin one day. So the one thing that really interests him in the first Zionist Congress is that conversation. Why? Because like back in, a decade or so earlier, right? A decade and more earlier, he'd been writing about, well, we need to like maybe modernize halacha, make it more efficient, streamline it, find ways to deal with contemporary issues, find halachic resolutions, contemporary issues. So he writes a little paragraph writes a little article about that, but doesn't really get involved in these things. In 1902, there actually is the creation of a religious wing or religious party within the Zionist movement. It's called the Mizrahi. It's founded by Rav Yaakov Reines. He's not a part of that. That sort of party politics doesn't interest him. And also, from the little bit that he knows about it, it really disturbs him that the Mizrahi are willing to see themselves as subordinate players in the world Zionist movement. So now a moment like, what do we mean by Zionism, right? Especially nowadays in the war that we're in, people toss these terms around a lot. So for our purposes, or how I understand it, what do we mean by Zionism? If we look, because also part of what makes Zionism a hard thing to define is that there's so many self-described Zionists who disagree with each other about everything. I think if you look at all of them in total, we could say that what they all share, Zionism is the position that Jewish survival, physical and or cultural, requires the creation of a Jewish collective of a new kind in the historic land of Israel. With that definition in hand, I can include everybody from the pacifist Zionist Martin Buber, right, to Itamar Ben-Gvir of today. I think that's something they all share. And the arguments, the disagreements, the machloksin are about how do you define physical survival? How do you define cultural survival? And is it physical and cultural, or just one or the other? Physical, but don't worry about cultural. Cultural, don't worry about physical. And what do you mean by a new kind of Jewish collective? What's new about it? That it's a state, that it's a different kind of cooperative settlement, that yeshivot have to look differently, that educations of higher learning have to look differently. That's where the arguments begin. So the Mizrahi at those years very much were of the view that Zionism is here to help Jewish physical survival. Of the different, Jews have tremendous problems of anti-Semitism, of poverty, of social disarray, and there's different programs to address that. And of the ones that are around here, Zionism is the best one we have. But please don't tell me that this is about Jewish culture. Keep that out of it. That touches on spirituality and religion, and that's our department, and this is not for you, Dr. Herzl, and all these people, right? And interestingly, in the Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl, he realizes that he needs rabbis and needs rabbinic approbation. And so he's willing to keep the cultural issues on a low burner in order to keep the rabbis happy. But it's a number of the younger Zionists from Eastern Europe, who are, especially their young leader at the time, Chaim Weizmann, who eventually becomes this distinguished, the architect of the Balfour Declaration, first president of the State of Israel, who is arguing that no, Zionism has to be both political and cultural. Right? Those are the arguments. So he's just not. Rabbi Kook isn't part of this. He's not part of the Zionist movement. He's not part of it. But it's starting in the early 1900s. He writes a series of essays in a journal called Hapeles, which is a Lithuanian rabbinic journal of a distinctively non/anti-Zionist cast. But he writes a series of articles on the idea of Jewish nationalism. So by now, he's starting to publish under his own name, right? And he writes these essays. He writes 3 important essays, to Dat Yisrael, Ulumiyuto, right? Israel's destiny and its national identity. Atzot Merachok, ideas from afar, and Afikim B'Negev, watercourses in the southern desert. And in this, he starts gingerly, with the help of Maimonidean philosophy, writing about the phenomenon of Jewish nationalism, not necessarily about Zionism as such, but obviously Zionism by implication. And he starts making the argument that Jews can be thought of as a nation alongside, in modern terms, but with a difference. That Jewish nationalism is meant to be governed by Torah, right? In some ways, there's an echo here of the teachings of Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, right? In Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, part of his polemics with Reform was that Reform said we're not a nation, we're a religion. And Shimshon Raphael Hirsch said, no, we're a nation, but a nation that's governed by Torah, right? And who's defined by Torah. And Rav Kook, in these early essays, says it's extremely important for Jewish national identity to be defined by Torah. Why? Because nationalism has a moral problem, right? Nationalism can easily degenerate into self-loving, violent chauvinism. And at one point he has a passage where he actually says, our le'umiyut is not nationalismus. He uses the Germanic word. Le'umiyut is governed by Torah, and so it will be ethical and it will be disciplined in those ways. But he also is making an argument to the Jewish nationalists that their nationalism will not be able to strike root and endure if it's not doesn't have a deep relationship to Jewish culture, including Torah and mitzvot. So his argument is both, he's trying to convey to his rabbinic peers how to think about and talk about these things while making an argument that he hopes will also be of interest to Jewish nationalists. This also where he starts talking about ideas of historical development. When he talks about vegetarianism, this is where he does, right? Where he talks about the vegetarian movement as an example of the moral progress of the human race. And he also is working with ideas of evolution, right? Darwin's theory of evolution, of course, was very popular. But he was less indebted to Darwin and more like the ideas of Herbert Spencer. Evolution understood as a constant upward motion, which to his mind worked nicely with any number of Kabbalistic ideas about how the world is always progressing closer and closer and closer to redemption. And in his notebooks, he also at this time writes a book. A lot of what goes on in these essays in Hapeles is also then put in a book that's only published a few years ago called Linvuchei Hador. If you want a gust of Rav Kook as a modern Orthodox rabbi, that's the book to read. That's the full flowering of his machshava before he goes to Eretz Yisrael, and it's meant in this very modern Orthodox fashion, a determined attempt to sort of bring traditional Judaism into a meaningful conversation with the modern world and liberalism and all of that. But in his notebooks, he's also writing some more far-reaching ideas. And he's starting to think that maybe the historical time that he's living in has about it a whiff of Yemot HaMashiach. Why? And this is where he starts synthesizing different ideas. There's the First, there's the idea of like in tradition, there's Mashiach ben Yosef, this obscure figure, Mashiach ben Yosef, who dies and thus like makes way for the advent of Mashiach ben David. And he starts developing these ideas. Maybe Mashiach ben Yosef is the restoration of the Jewish body. And maybe this is Jews entering politics. Maybe this is a character like Theodor Herzl, who's like has nothing to say about Torah, but is trying to ease anti-Semitism through political means, right? And then he also has ideas, again, central to his reflection is, and here, I guess, with two themes, this is like we'll end with for the two last machshava points for the day, and then talking about his transition to Eretz Yisrael. He, again, these principled rebels, right? There's the famous Mishnah Masechet Sota be'ikvita d'Mashiach chutz b'yaske, right? That at the time of the steps of the Messiah, footsteps, when you can hear the Messiah's footsteps in the distance, down the hall, so to speak, chutzpah will swell. And the Mishnah describes an apocalypse of authority, right? Students rebel against their teachers, daughters-in-law rebel against their mothers-in-law, right? Everything is falling apart. Now, in Kabbalat Ha'ari, there is this idea of nishamot, there's this idea of olam hatohu. I mean, we see it also in the Kabbalah of the Ramak, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero. There's, well, what was tohu? What's tohu and what's bohu, right? Tohu is a kind of chaos that precedes creation, but creation comes out of it, from it, right? It's a chaos out of which something good arises. And there's ideas in Kabbalat Ha'ari of that there's certain kinds of nishamot of olam de tohu. And that gets that's continued in Chabad Chassidut. And there's ideas of the Vilna Gaon that like there might be these mass eruptions of heresy around the time of Yemos HaMashiach. So he starts synthesizing these ideas, and he looks, my classmates from yeshiva who are chutzpahdik, right? And casting off the yoke of authority and doing so, and then like moving to Eretz Yisrael and helping the Jewish people. And he also begins to write, he says, they say that our religious ideas are primitive, and they're right, because we haven't kept up with, we stopped learning philosophy after the Rambam. We've sort of intellectually disarmed ourselves. And there's, alongside this, he starts developing this idea that every part of the Jewish people has a role to play. We need Talmidei Chachamim, and we need working class people. And you need Jews who know how to talk to Gentiles, and you need Jews who are Kulam B'Kodesh and Merukazim Rak B'Kodesh. You need people who are very involved in social justice, and you need people who are artists, because that is also a part of the human condition. Right? It's around this time that he writes what becomes his introduction to Shir HaShirim. How is it that Shir HaShirim is, Rabbi Akiva's line, like that Shir HaShirim is Kodesh Kodeshim, because it expresses the true inner soul of the person. So he starts thinking about art and aesthetics. And again, this is a period that's seeing a remarkable flowering of Hebrew literature, and people are turning towards literature to seek the kind of spiritual vitality and spontaneity and almost moral authority that they're having a hard time finding in religious texts. So, in the around 1902, 1903, a position opens up to be but in the meanwhile, he has moved from his little shtetl. In 1896, he becomes the rabbi of Bauska. It's a mid-sized Lithuanian town, about 10,000 people. I visited there a number of years ago. And that generally is also part of his exposure to a broader and more cosmopolitan world, but within limits. I mean, we're still talking about like a big town in Latvia. The Aderet, his former father-in-law, to whom he's still very close, is in the meanwhile moved Kaman Aliyah and moved to Yerushalayim to be like the number 2 and ostensible successor to Rav Shmuel Salant, the long-standing Rav of the Ashkenazi community of Jerusalem. Rav Levi Weinman, who was a Lithuanian Talmud Chacham and Kabbalist, dies. It's like Weinman, and the position opens up. And interestingly, Yoel Moshe Solomon, who was one of the founders of the new city of Jerusalem and one of the founders of Petach Tikva, had met Avram Yitzchak Kook on one of his fundraising trips through Eastern Europe and was deeply impressed by him. And he knows he's the Aderet's son-in-law, and he writes to the Aderet and says, maybe your son-in-law he knows the Aderet's father-in-law, maybe your son-in-law wants to come to Yafo. And basically what happens is there's like the traditional-minded chalutzim, like Yoel Moshe Solomon is a descendant of Aliyat Talmidei Hagra. The traditional-minded chalutzim who think, because you have to understand, we're talking like the city of Tel Aviv isn't founded until 1909, right? So in 1904, Yafo is the metropolis of what's starting to get called HaYishuv HaChadash, the new Yishuv, right? The new Jewish community that's taking shape in the land of Israel, right? And that is interested in building institutions and in building agriculture and building civic institutions and also maybe eventually building new cities and creating a Hebrew culture, right? So Yafo is the center of that. And the job is to be the rabbi of what's called Yafo v'hamoshavot, Yafo and the surrounding agricultural colonies. And so a group of Balabatim and Chalutzim and moderate rabbis coalesce around the idea of bringing Avram Yitzchak Kook, who they know he's a big Talmud Chacham, and who actually seems to have been thinking in creative ways about how to deal with this new situation. Interestingly, so he's offered the job. He's very, very careful. He's very, very careful to not want, and very characteristic for him, he doesn't want machloksim. So he really takes his time because he needs to make sure that the sons of the previous occupant of the position are okay with his taking the job and that there's some sort of consensus around his coming, and eventually decides to go. Now, interestingly, the people who are part of the religious Zionist, the formal religious Zionist world, this religious Zionist party in the World Zionist movement, they've never heard of him. They ask, who is he? Right, there's an amazing passage. Rav Yitzchak Nissenbaum was the personal secretary to Shmuel Mohilever, an important figure in religious Zionism. Eventually, he was murdered by the Nazis in the Warsaw Ghetto. He writes an autobiography called Ali Chaldi in the 1920s, and he says, when Rav Kook first got the job in Yafo, I thought, who is he? He wasn't part of Kibbutz Zion. He wasn't part of the Zionist movement. He wasn't part of the Mizrahi. He hadn't published many books. He hadn't, So he says, I went to Boysk, to his town, and spent a few days with him. And he says, Matzati yashav lefanai Rav lo ragil. And he said he observed that he was a big Talmud Chacham, Babli, Yerushalmi, all this stuff was at his fingertips, but that wasn't it. He said he sees that he's trying to create some new spiritual synthesis for him. And he's reading everything. He's learning philosophy, and he's learning Medrash, and he's learning Kabbalah, and he's reading medieval Hebrew poetry, and he's learning Tanakh, and he's reading modern Hebrew literature, and he's reading all these things, and he's trying to create some sort of new synthesis for Torah, and this is going to be very interesting. When he leaves the town of Boysk, the people love him. He's very involved in chesed activities. He was very ascetic his whole life, starting as a shul rabbi. He lived in poverty his whole life. Other rabbis sometimes resented that he seemed to be when rabbis would get together, he was so ascetic and so learning all the time that he sort of they thought who is this young whippersnapper and why is he trying to be such a tzaddik all the time? But he generally, so the people of Boysk really didn't want him to go, but they did, and he left them and he said, but Torah always keeps us together. And with that, he goes by train. He's never left Eastern Europe, of course. Goes through Turkey, through Syria, and comes to Yafo, gets off the boat in summer of 1904 and kisses the ground. And that's when a very new chapter will begin. But I guess but the point is that there was an awful lot that he brought an awful lot with him. And he had been thinking an awful lot about these things in ways that didn't slot into the obvious conventional categories of Orthodox, Maskil, Chassid, Misnagid, Zionist, non-Zionist. And that's how he begins there in Yafo.
Well, thank you for that overview. I didn't even get a word in there. That was
I know. I'm
great.
sorry. I feel terrible about that.
Well, that was great, and I was listening, and so the funny thing is to tell the listeners is that really is covered extensively in your it's your second book, but I think it's your first work originally, which is Towards the Mystical Experience of Modernity, and that I'll link to that in the show's notes. I'll also link to the full biography, Rav Kook, Mystic in a Time of Revolution, but we only covered chapter 1 in that book, so I'll say we're up to
also maybe you want to send people links to some of these other works of his that I mentioned, like Mitziot Katan, Midbar Shur. Some of them, by the way, are now appearing in English translation.
Yes, so I will.
And also, for now, a number of his notebooks from this time were published by his son Rabbi Yehudah under the title Musar Avicha. And Rabbi Josh Gerstein has self-published, but hopefully it'll be coming out in a different edition soon, a wonderful translation of that with notes and explanatory comments. You could find it on Amazon as well. There's this explosion of good translations.
There's been a lot of stuff published by Betzalel Naor. Some is through Koren, some himself, some through exactly. So I'll link to some of that. I'll keep it I'll link to what's in this episode. I'll link to your books, Professor Mirsky, and some others.
Also other people.
I'll put some of the other material that people can listen to. I also just wanted to make a general comment. So first of all, one of the things earlier I just wanted to make sure we emphasize. You're talking about the Kabbalah. You mentioned the Leshem, who is Rav Shlomo Elyashiv, Yosef Shlomo Elyashiv's grandfather, and also Rav Kook was involved with the Shidduch, and he was Masada Kedushin for Rav Elyashiv, who used to go to him. So that just
that's Rav Elyashiv. There's all kinds of stories about Rav Elyashiv, Zichronu Livracha, and his attitude towards Rav Kook. We could talk about that as well, and also Bichlal, these Yerushalmi Gedolim, Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and others. There's Masechet Shlema about their relationships with him.
Rav Shlomo Zalman, I think Rav Kook also was Masada Kedushin by Rav Shlomo Zalman's chasana.
And his father, Chaim Leib, was also like a Lithuanian Makubal. He had this yeshivat Shar Shamayim.
Yes.
Okay, so here's a little story. A number of years ago, Machon Yerushalayim, published a book about Shemitah, and the Avrei who wrote it, didn't mention Rav Kook's book on Shemitah Shabbat Haaretz. And when they said, how do you do it? He said, listen. So he said, no, I can't, and he refused. So they said, let's go to Reb Shlomo Zalman. And Reb Shlomo Zalman, I believe it was Reb Shlomo Zalman, said, because I think it was
I think it was Rav Elyashiv.
Yes, right. That was Rav Elyashiv.
I think this story
was something else.
I think this story is actually in the Rav Elyashiv biography. I think because
that was the end. You're right. It was Rav Elyashiv that they went to him and because Machon Yerushalayim said we can't publish it, and Rav Elyashiv agreed with them. He said you don't have to like the man's hashkafa is on Zionism, but a genuine Gadol B'Torah writes a very consequential book on Shemitah, and even if you disagree with it, you can't ignore it. You can't pretend it doesn't exist. Lots of stories like that.
And so for the listeners and those wondering, well, where was the controversy? Well, I hope, first of all, this was why we explained Rav Kook and the interesting personality and everything that was involved. But the controversy is coming in the next episode. So the Shemitah controversy, the sesame oil controversy, and really his relationship.
The Eliezer ben Yehudah controversy.
His relation, the eulogy for Herzl, and then also it's going to be the relationship with the Rebbe of Chaim Sonnenfeld and the old Yishuv. And that's something that's really going to come to the forefront when he gets to Eretz Yisrael. That'll be the part 2 where we get to that. And
also it's very much something that's with us down to the present. Like the templates, including the institutional structures that he creates and that the Eidah Haredis creates in response to him.
Yes, all of that, the speech at Hebrew U, and all of this will be in part 2, and part 2 will end. I'll just give a teaser that'll be covered in part 2. His beginning of his time in Jaffa and Eretz Yisrael, and then he goes World War I. He gets stuck. He ends up in Europe. He's in Switzerland. He's in England. We'll cover that, and then part 3 will cover his return, being the chief rabbi, his and the rest of his life until his passing in 1935, as well as his writings, the publication, and his impact and the legacy today.
And of course, the legacy, which is highly contested down to this day. There's still articles in Israeli newspapers arguing back and forth. What would Rav Kook say about this or that?
Yes. So we will get to more of that. And this was just the first episode.
Thank you so much. And I hope next time you won't let me crowd you out so much. I'm sorry.
Not a problem at all. Thank you. And like I said, I'll link to your books in the show's notes here, and I'll link to some of the other works as well. Anything that's accessible,
please.
I'll try to put them in the show's notes.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you to the listener.